What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Nightblade. The Stamina Nightblade is the strongest stamina DPS currently in the game, and arguably the strongest DPS overall in the game. When it comes to PvE content, they have the highest single target DPS, and they do have some pretty decent cleave damage as well, with their Endless Hail and Caltrops. So Stamina Nightblades are definitely going to make up a very large portion of the Stam DPS that you're going to be seeing in endgame trials. You might see a couple of Stam Sorks or a Stamplar here and there, but Nightblades typically outparse them by a fairly decent margin. So Nightblades are still by and far above and beyond pretty much all the other classes when it comes to DPS on Stamina, as they are on Magicka as well. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our skills, our attributes, everything under the sun about our build. I do have several gear sets that I do want to talk about, and the strengths and advantages of using each of them. So we'll be going over that once we talk about our gear sets. We'll be demonstrating our rotation on a 6 million dummy, just to kind of go over what's going on in the rotation, why we're doing certain things, what you want to prioritize, things like that. And then we'll top things off with a 6 million dummy parse, so you guys can get an idea of the level of DPS that you're able to pull using a Stamina Nightblade. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here with our gear. So for our Monster Helm sets, we are sticking with Selene's. Because they changed how light attacks scale in Summerset, they now scale off of your max resource pool as well as your spell and weapon damage by 10.5. So basically every 10.5 additional max stamina you have results in one additional basically damage to your light attacks. Selene's ends up being very strong here. Velidreth is also a good option to use as well if you don't have Selene's, but Selene's is arguably easier to obtain than Velidreth's, so we're sticking with that. Selene's also has very good synergy with one of our primary sets here, which is Relequen, which drops from the new Cloud Rest trial. So we have the perfected Relequen's set here, but you can go with the imperfect version of this set. The difference between the perfect and imperfect version is the loss of that max stamina on the 5-piece. Everything else remains exactly the same, so you still get weapon crit, 2 things of weapon crit and minor slayer on the imperfect version. You just lose that max stamina on the imperfect version. So you will need to have all 5 of your Relequen pieces to be perfect in order to get that additional max stamina. So for example, if you have 3 perfect and 2 imperfect, then you will not get that max stamina. And so Relequen pairs very nicely with Selene's because the proc from Relequen's, right now at least, counts as direct melee damage. So you're able to proc Selene's while you're on your back bar now. So that's kind of why Selene starts edging out Velidreth's, because now you're able to get those Selene procs while you're on your bow bar, compared to in Dragon Bones, when you wouldn't be able to get Selene's procs while you're on your front bar typically. Now for our second 5-piece, you do have several options when it comes to sets. So here we're using the Advancing Yokeda set, which comes from Helra Citadel. It is typically a heavy armor set, but so you will have to transmute your jewelry traits because they only come in healthy if you're getting them as drops. So we have 3 weapon damage glyphs, and then in terms of traits, we have 1 bloodthirsty and 2 infused. That's going to be the strongest combination of traits in a raid scenario. For dummies, you might see something like 3 bloodthirsty, but bloodthirsty does have sort of diminishing returns as you have more and more people using bloodthirsty, just because you don't have as much time for bloodthirsty to take effect. So typically speaking, you're going to go with 2 infused and 1 bloodthirsty in a raid scenario here. For our front bar here, we are going with Advancing Yokeda, so you want Relequen active at all times because the stacks do last for 5 seconds. So we have Advancing Yokeda on our front bar here. So Advancing Yokeda is kind of a set that not a lot of people were using back in Dragon Bones because it was a heavy armor set, but now that we can transmute jewelry traits, Advancing Yokeda is very strong. It gives you 2 things of weapon crit, 1 thing of weapon damage, and then when you deal melee damage, your crit strike rating is increased by 400 for 5 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, so that gives you effectively almost 10% additional crit chance when you have all 5 stacks going. Now this does last for 5 seconds, so you will end up typically losing the stack on your back when you finish your back bar rotation, but there is a way to maintain the stacks, which I will demonstrate on the 6 million dummy when we get there. But you do have a lot of different options when it comes to this 5-piece set here. So you always want Relequen to be active. One thing about Relequen though is that it is only applied on your light and heavy attack. So if you have to swap between targets very often, for example in Halls of Fabrication on the Refab Committee, you're swapping targets very often, Relequen loses a lot of power. So Relequen is mainly going to be very strong when you are looking for single target DPS, when you don't have to worry about swapping to a different target, to hit the ads. So Halls of Fabrication, the Refab Committee is the classic example of that. So if you do need to swap out between targets, you do have two potential options, really three, when it comes to sets. So the first one that you might want to consider using is going to be War Machine, which drops from Halls of Fabrication. This basically lets you give yourself and two other players close to you Major Slayer for 10 seconds. Because our primary ultimate is going to be Incapacitating Strike, you can basically get around 40% uptime with Major Slayer by yourself using Incap. So War Machine is very strong. It's a very good group utility set. The other option that you might consider is going to be Vicious Ophidian. This drops from all the different Kra'gh Lorn trials. This just helps out your sustain by a huge amount by reducing the cost of your stamina abilities by 8%. So this really helps you basically maintain a light attack rotation throughout the entirety of your parse. So Vicious Ophidian is still a very strong choice, but it's not going to be as strong as Relequen's or War Machine. And then the final set, if you don't have either War Machine or Vicious Ophidian, is going to be Hunting's Rage. That's a crafted set. 6 traits are required in order to craft Hunting's Rage, but you can't just buy it off of Guild Traders because it is not a trial drop. So that's the advantage of using Hunting's Rage. But Vicious Ophidian and War Machine both do outparse Hunting's Rage when you have that active as your 5-piece effect there. So for our second 5-piece effect, instead of using Advanced Yokeda, you have a lot of different options, a lot of different sets that you could choose from. You can go with Briarheart, which drops from Hrothgar. So whenever you deal critical damage, you have a 10% chance to increase your weapon damage by 449 for 10 seconds. And while this is active, your critical hits do heal you for 609 health, so it does give you some additional survivability as well. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds, so this ends up being an effective about 300 weapon damage increase, so pretty much on par with Hunting's Rage, except it does carry over to your back bar for a longer period of time because it does last for 10 seconds. Mechanical Acuity is the another option. This is a crafted set from Clockwork City. It requires 6 traits in order to craft it. So whenever you deal direct damage, you have 15% chance to basically gain 100% crit chance for 5 seconds, and this can occur once every 18 seconds. So this is still a very strong set, even though they did change it so it only procs off of direct damage. So this is again a craftable set, so very easy to obtain. The only downside is if you do want to use jewelry, you will have to level up jewelry crafting in order to get CP 160 jewelry. Veiled Heritance is another potential option here. Veiled Heritance is a heavy armor set that drops from Auradon, so you will have to transmute the jewelry if you happen to be looking for the jewelry, because you do want the jewelry and weapons, because again it is a heavy armor set, so you do not want to wear the armor itself necessarily. So it is a little bit weird when it comes to the 2, 3, 4-piece bonus. So it's weapon damage, physical resistance, and weapon crit. So the additional physical resistance does help out your survivability a little bit, but it's not going to be as useful as spell resistance, just because you're not really going to be taking that much physical damage in a lot of the trials that you'll be running. So the 5-piece effect, when you deal any damage, you have a 10% chance to increase your weapon damage by 400 for 5 seconds. As far as I can tell, this does have an internal cooldown of 5 seconds, but this does proc off of any damage, not just melee damage, so that's kind of the advantage of Veiled Heritance. So Veiled Heritance is a good option there. And then our final set that you could consider running is going to be Ravaging. Ravager. This is a PvP set that you can get from coffers that you buy from Vestarius in Cyrodiil, or you can get them from Rewards of the Worthy or End of Campaign rewards. So this is another heavy set, so you will need to go for the jewelry and the weapons, so you will have to transmute those jewelry traits. This gives you weapon crit, max health, and weapon damage. The health basically allows you to shift all your points from into stamina, and we'll go over that when we go over a character sheet. Because we are using Dubious Camoran Throne, so this does actually give us a little bit of additional survivability and gives us a little bit more max stamina compared to using any of the other sets that we previously talked about. So with Ravaging, when you deal melee damage, you have an 8% chance to increase your weapon damage by 645 for 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. Now, if you're going to be using Ravager, it's going to be best paired with Relequen, because the Relequen proc does count as melee damage currently. So that 8% chance, basically you have a pretty good chance of having that proc more or less on cooldown. It does last for 10 seconds, and it is a much larger weapon damage increase, and it doesn't technically have any sort of cooldown, so you could theoretically get 100% uptime if you're able to time the procs correctly, but realistically you're looking more closer to maybe 60 to 70% uptime with Ravager with Relequen. So advancing Yokeda is probably going to be the best option. I've had the best results with advancing Yokeda, but Ravagers, any of the other sets that I just described, Ravager, Veiled Heritance, Mechanical Acuity, Briarheart, those are all potentially good options as well. The difference between DPS between all four of these sets is pretty small. It's between 1 to 2k on a 6 million dummy parse, so you can realistically go for any of them. So for example, if you don't have Advancing Yokeda farmed up, because it is a trial drop, then you can just buy Veiled Heritance from guild traders while you're farming Advancing Yokeda. So that's pretty much it. So I am actually using one heavy armor piece, so it's my heavy shoulders with a max health enchant on it, and again, that's just because we are using Dubious Camoran Throne. That does give us less health compared to blue food, so we do need to make that up with a heavy armor piece and a health enchant as well. Alright, so that's pretty much it for gear. Weapon traits and enchants. So for our weapons, you're going to go with Dagger, Axe, but you can go with Double Dagger if you'd like, if you want to. I'm on the PTS, so I'm going with Dagger, Axe because I don't get 2 daggers with our coffers. But realistically, 2 daggers is going to be stronger than Dagger, Axe. So your main hand should be Nirn with a poison damage enchant, and your offhand should be a infused with a weapon damage enchant. And that's because you don't inherit all the damage from your offhand. You get all the damage from your main hand though, so you want Nirn on your main hand, so that way you get the full 200 additional damage. And then for our back bar, still the Maelstrom Bow. Maelstrom Bow is still very strong. We have Nirn here, but you do have several different options when it comes to traits. You go with Nirn or you can go with Precise. Those are going to be the 2 primary traits that you'll see being used on Maelstrom. Now, we are using Double Ravage Health poisons here, but they don't stack on each other, so if you have multiple people running Ravage Health poisons, it might be beneficial actually to swap to an infused Maelstrom Bow and have something like a disease enchant instead. So that's going to be really dependent on your group dynamic there. Typically speaking, if you have 4 or less stamina DPS, running Ravage Health isn't going to be that big of a drop. If you're running something like 5 or more stamina DPS, then it might be worth swapping for one of your DPS to swap to an infused Maelstrom with disease enchant, just so you're not losing as much DPS from losing out on damage health poison procs. Alright, now let's go move over to our character sheet. So I am a Wood Elf. Technically speaking, Red Guards are going to be the strongest when it comes to DPS. So Red Guards get 10% max stamina, I believe 9% stamina regen, and they get some additional stamina back whenever they deal damage with a melee attack every, I believe, 5 seconds. So Red Guards are really strong when it comes to stamina DPS. Wood Elves get, I believe, 6% max stamina. They get 21% stamina regen, and they are immune to poison and disease status effects. So if you do PvP a lot, it could be beneficial to have a Wood Elf, so that way you don't get affected by any sort of poison enchants or any sort of disease enchants. So those apply the poison debuff as well as the major defile debuff, so that's very useful to have for PvP. Other potential options for stamina DPS races are going to be the Khajiit. They get no max stamina enchant passive. They do get 10% stamina regen, and they get 6% additional crit chance. So if you aren't using Acuity, being a Khajiit pretty much gives you a crap ton of weapon crit. I believe a Khajiit Nightblade that I run with maxed out at, I believe, 91% crit chance when they were using Advancing Yokeda. So that's huge. That's pretty much like you have essentially Acuity active at all times if you're running Advancing Yokeda with the Khajiit Nightblade. Alright, and then you could also go with Imperial if you do have access to the Imperial Edition. So they get 10% max health and 10% max stamina, I believe. They don't get any sort of additional sustain boost, so no regen at all. And they do get some health back whenever they deal melee damage, so that does help out your survivability a lot. The primary advantage of running Imperial is that additional health, so you don't have to put any points into health. If you're using Dubious, you can just put all your points into stamina here. So talking about our attribute traits, we do have 10 points into health, and again, that's because we're using Dubious, Camoran, Throne. So we do need to make up for that loss in health compared to using blue food. So we have 10 points here. Again, if you're an Imperial, you don't need to put 10 points into health. You can safely put like no points in health and shift them all into stamina if you'd like. And if you are using Ravager, then you also don't need any points in health. You can pretty much put all your points into stamina as well. But if you're using anything besides Ravager, or if you are not an Imperial, then you will need 10 points into health if you are using Dubious, Camoran, Throne. That leaves our health with about 17k, which is about the minimum that I would recommend for vet trials. And then that gives us around 29.6 max stamina. Because we are losing out on robust, because we are using infused and bloodthirsty instead. If you're using Ravager or if you're an Imperial, your stamina pool is going to be higher. You'll be sitting at around 31k instead. For our Mundustone, we're going with the Lover. Because of the changes to Night Mother's Gaze and Sunderflame, stamina DPS don't have a lot of group penetration sets anymore, so we are going with the Lover instead here. You can go with the Warrior if you would like, but if you go with the Warrior, you will have to replace one of your sets here with Twice Fang Snake. That's typically going to be your body piece. So it's up to you which Mundus you want to run. You're going to get better luck with using the Lover and putting a couple of points into piercing. So that's kind of how it all stands, but you can also use Twice Fang with the Warrior instead. It's really based on you. Like I've been saying, we're using Dubious, Camoran, Throne for the stamina regen, so we're able to maintain a full light attack rotation with very few heavy attacks mixed in here. But it does mean we have lower max stamina and lower max health, so we do end up losing a little bit of DPS this way, but the regen definitely makes up for it. Now in Summerset, there is a new basically gold food that is basically a slightly upgraded version of Dubious, Camoran, Throne. So if you do happen to have that food, then you can go ahead and use that instead. But it's not that big of a DPS difference, so just stick with Dubious unless you are able to afford that new gold food. Now for our skill bars, no matter what set you're running, your skill bars are going to remain pretty much exactly the same. So for our front bar, we have Killer's Blade, it's our Execute, Surprise Attack, Deadly Cloak, Relentless Focus, Rending Slashes. You can go with the other morph, which is Blood Craze. I personally like Blood Craze because it does give you a nice heal over time, and the DPS difference is going to be pretty small. But Rending Slashes is technically going to be stronger than Blood Craze because of that higher initial hit there. Then Flawless Dawnbreaker. This is not really here for to be used. This is here for that weapon damage boost. So we get 5% from Flawless plus 3% from the passive under the Fighters Guild line, so we get 8% additional weapon damage while we're on our front bar here. Now for our back bar, we have the tried and true staple back bar stamina rotation. So we have Caltrops, Poison Injection, Endless Hail, and Rearming Trap, and then we have Leeching Strikes. This is a powerful source of sustain for us. This is really what's going to help us basically maintain our light attack rotation here. Then Incapacitating Strike, which is going to be our primary ultimate that we're going to be using throughout the fight. Now, in terms of flex spots, you don't really have that many flex spots. If you do need to swap out an ability for example, Vigor, you would probably want to swap out Rending Slashes or Blood Craze. While it is a fairly decent dot, it's not the strongest dot that you're going to be using, and it's probably the least important skill out of all of these skills here. So if you do need to use Vigor, then get rid of Rending Slashes and put Vigor on your front bar here, so your bars would then end up looking something like this. So you will end up losing out on Rending Slashes that way. But you will gain that nice heal from Vigor instead. And like I said, it doesn't really matter which setup you have, you will always have pretty much the exact same bar setup that you have here. Now for our CPs, our CP cap is now 750, which gives us 250 points to split across each of the constellations. So starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Mooncap, 75 in Tenacity. That leaves us 100 points that you can split into the remaining nodes however you'd like. So I have 40 into Shadow Ward, 31 into Tumbling, and 29 into Warlord. But you can again distribute those however you would like depending on the passives that you want. For our blue CPs, I do want to mention here that I am optimized for having Alkosh in the group. So if you don't have Alkash, you will need to put more points into piercing, so because you are losing out on the extra penetration from Alkash. I'm also assuming that we have a Stamplar or somebody running Sunderflame, so that way we have our Minor Fracture as well. So that's why I have 17 points into piercing. But again, depending on whether you have Alkash or if you have Sunderflame or a Stamplar, you might need to put more points into piercing to make up for that penetration. So just put points into piercing until you get about to the penetration cap of 18,200. Then you can kind of split your CPs however you'd like among the remaining nodes here. So 64 into Mighty, 61 to Precise Strikes, 52 into Thaumaturge, then 56 into Master at Arms here. So if you do need to put more points into piercing because you don't have Alkash, I would recommend taking out of Mighty first, drop this down to 56, drop Precise Strikes down to 56, and you can drop Master at Arms down to 51, so that it would look something like this. So you would be able to get 18 points back, so you'd be able to go all the way up to 35 in piercing. This doesn't really make up entirely for Alkash, losing out Alkash, so it only gains, you only gain about another 1500 or so penetration, so you will need to make up a couple more points into piercing, but that's kind of a good starting point for you to kind of look into kind of redistributing your points here in the blue CPs if you do need to put more points into piercing. Now finally for our red CPs. For those of you guys who have followed my builds for a while, you know I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach with red CPs, but depending on the specific trial that you're running, you might want to redistribute those CPs to kind of maximize the amount of mitigation that you're able to get from the different damage sources from trials. So for a balanced approach, you want to go 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick Skin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. One node that I do want to quickly mention is going to be Quick Recovery. If you put 11 points into Quick Recovery, 11 to get that jump point, you do get access to the Field Physician passive, which basically reduces the amount of damage you take while you're resurrecting another player. This is particularly useful for progression style guilds because basically reducing the damage you take while you're rezzing is going to be very useful, so that way you don't die while you're resurrecting somebody. Typically speaking though, magic DPS are going to be resurrecting first because they do have access to shields, but again, this is a very nice passive to have, and I do recommend that you do pick up this passive in a progression style guild because you will usually have to end up rezzing somebody, typically a fellow melee DPS. Alright, so that's pretty much it for all the build information. So now let's talk about our rotation. So there's basically two options that you have here. You can go with a static rotation, or you can basically interrupt your backbar rotation to prioritize your bow procs. If you're using Advancing Yokeda, you might want to go with the prioritizing your bow procs instead of having a static backbar rotation. So if you're going for a static rotation, basically what you want to do is I like to open up with Rearming Trap and then make sure you have your two buffs active, so Relentless and Leeching. Open up with Rearming Trap, and your backbar is just Endless Hail, Caltrops, and then Poison Inject, swap out of Poison Injection, and then you basically pretty much apply all your dots, use Surprise Attack as your spamble, and then basically go through your back bar. So Endless Hail, Caltrops, Rearming Trap, Leeching if you need it, and then Poison Injection. If your ultimate is up, you would go Incap, then Poison Injection. So your back bar would look like this. Incap and then Poison Injection, and so that's, you want to bar swap cancel out of Poison Injection, so that way you're on your front bar when that first tick happens, so it inherits the damage from your front bar instead of from your back bar. You have higher weapon damage on your front bar here, so that's why you want to bar swap cancel out of Poison Injection there. Now that's the static rotation. It's pretty much, like I said, it's pretty static. It's step 1, step 2, step 1, step 2. If you want to prioritize your bow proc instead, and that also helps maintain advancing your Yokeda stacks, this is pretty much what it would look like. So it would help if I actually had my buffs up. Basically, you would interrupt your rotation. I would interrupt it here, flip my front bar, do my bow, and then go back to my front bar rotation there. This does mean, however, that your front bar dots are going to be a little bit offset. It's not really that big of a deal. You can see here Poison Injection actually ended up running out about the time that I would normally be applying it in a static rotation. So that just helps maintain the advanced Yokeda procs. Even with a static rotation though, you're able to maintain roughly 75 to 80% uptime on the max stack. So if you do happen to prioritize your bow proc, it's basically you're interrupting your backbar rotation. In order to maintain advancing Yokeda, you're able to basically maintain almost 100% uptime on it. So you're looking at about a 20% increase in uptime, which would result in about 2% additional crit chance on average. So if you can, I would highly recommend learning how to interrupt your backbar rotation in order to do your bow proc. So again, this is kind of what it would look like for static rotation. You would incap and then do your poison inject. So this is a static rotation here. You re-up leeching when it expires. And if you want to do a non-static rotation, if you want to prioritize your bow proc so you maintain your advancing Yokeda stacks, that's what you would do. You just interrupt. You'd basically interrupt your backbar rotation in order to get that bow proc off. So again, at 4 stacks, you would go swap, and then go back to your backbar and finish off your backbar rotation. So that's pretty much the rotation there. So a couple of things that you're going to want to really want to maintain here. You're basically Endless Hail and Razor Caltrops are going to be your 2 strongest dots, so you always want to make sure those are ticking. So Endless Hail does have a 2-second duration before it actually starts to do any sort of damage, so just keep that in mind there. Ideally, you want to swap to your back bar as Endless Hail is about to fall off, because it does inherit the weapon damage of the bar you're currently on. So if you're using the Maelstrom Bow, your ticks do get stronger and stronger as the skill continues to apply itself. So you want your last ticks are always going to be your strongest ticks. So you want to make sure you're getting the higher weapon damage on your ticks here. So when we do our full 6 million dummy rotation, you'll see that I basically almost let Endless Hail completely run out while on the front bar before I reapply it. So that way I get my strongest ticks while I'm still on my front bar with the higher weapon damage. Caltrops again is a very strong dot. You want to make sure that's always down. Then you want to make sure you have your 2 buffs up at all times, Relentless and Leeching. Leeching very important for your sustain, and then Relentless for those bow procs there. Deadly Cloak is a very important skill to also maintain at all times, not necessarily for the damage, but because of the damage mitigation. So you do reduce your damage taken by 25% from area of effect attacks, and that's really helpful for your survivability, because a lot of your damage that's incoming in trials are classified as area of effect attacks. So it's very important to have Deadly Cloak up at all times. Now for our execute rotation here, you basically I tend to drop Caltrops, so I maintain Endless Hail, Poison Injection, and Rearming Trap on my back bar. So basically my rotation looks like this. I still do Incap before that. And then I also drop Rending Slashes. I do maintain Deadly Cloak in a trial. In the parse, I will probably drop Deadly Cloak. And you also want to maintain your 2 buffs. So you just replace Surprise Attack with Killer's Blade during execute phase. So I drop Caltrops. Some people still do their full back bar rotation. It's kind of up to you if you want to do that or not. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with our 6 million dummy parse. This will give you an idea of the amount of DPS you can pull with a Stamina Nightblade. So do keep in mind that Stamina Nightblades do have access to Major Fracture via Surprise Attack, as well as Minor Berserk from Relentless Focus. So a Stamina Nightblade parse is going to naturally be higher compared to other classes, mainly because they have access to Minor Berserk from Relentless Focus. Not all Stamina DPS classes have access to Major Fracture, so Stamina Wardens and Stamina DKs do have access to Major Fracture, but Stamina Sorks and Stamina Templars do not. So that's kind of why you see such a huge disparity in solo dummy parses between a Stamina Nightblade and Sorks and Templars. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And we are using Advancing Yokeda, so I will be using the dynamic rotation where I am prioritizing that bow proc on the front bar to maintain my stacks here. I'm not as fluent with that as I am with my static rotation, so you can't actually hit higher than what I'm going to be hitting today. And then we are using Relequens with Selene's as well, so if you're using something like War Machine or Vicious Ophidian, you will not be able to hit as high with Relequen. Relequen pretty much matches Endless Hail or sometimes beats out Endless Hail when it comes to DPS contribution. So that's something to consider as well. Alright, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this parse here. So again, I am prioritizing my bow procs. Gonna go back to my back bar here and basically finish off my rotation. I do also typically have to do a heavy attack every so often in order to maintain our resources here. You can see here, this is fairly dynamic here because we are swapping to our front bar so often. Now we are at execute, so we're not using surprise attack anymore. So there we go. That is a dummy parse there with the dynamic rotation kind of prioritizing that bow proc. So we did get 48k, and if we take a look at my buffs are all on the same page here, but Berserking Warrior, the last stack here, we can see we got 88% uptime here. So we got 48.1k, 48.2k. I've seen parses as high as 55k from Nightblades who are a little bit better with maintaining that sort of rotation. And you can see here that Relequen is very, very strong. It's a very strong set here, pretty much matching Endless Hail when it comes to DPS contribution. So that attacks, because of the rescaling, it's very strong now. And you can see here that our max crit was 91% and our mean crit was 90.9%. Or sorry, weapon damage, weapon crit here. So our max is 77.3, our mean was 74.2. If we were Khajiit, add on 6% to that, and you have about 83.3 and 80.2. So really, really high levels of crit here. You can see all of our Killer's Blade actually ended up critting, even though we weren't using Acuity at all. So if you take a look at the number of critical hits that we got, 61.5. So this is actually on the lower end when it comes to the number of crits that we managed to get when we compare it to the mean amount of crit chance that we have here. Again, that is a dynamic rotation. So with a static rotation, which I'm more familiar with, I am actually able to pull a little bit higher. So see if I can find a comparable parse. You can see here I'm able to pull 50k with a static rotation here. This is an Acuity parse here, so 52.2, or no, that's not the right one that I want to show you guys. So here, Armor of the Veiled Heritance, I pulled about 50.9. This is with a static rotation. This is Berserking Warrior with a static rotation, 51.2. Again, the difference here is mainly because I'm not as familiar with the dynamic rotation as I am with the static rotation. So the static rotation does end up pulling a little bit higher. 81% uptime on the full stack of Berserking Warrior. We do end up with a little bit lower mean crit chance, but the static rotation is a little bit easier to learn, and it's definitely easier to maintain. So those are kind of examples of what you can expect to see with a static rotation compared to a dynamic rotation. So that is it for this video. If you have any questions or comments about this build, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I definitely read all the comments left on all my videos. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.